Hi everyone, welcome to BRICS Briefs. Today we're going to look more deeply at the China-Africa relationship with a focus on the recent Forum of China-Africa Cooperation. That's the FOCAC event. The event occurred in Beijing, China, with the last one occurring 6 years ago. So it's about time, a live event. It's actually done every 3 years, I've been told, but because of the COVID, the last one was not live. Last time we took up the topic of Africa and China specifically. We spoke with Jana de Kluiver in a broad and general discussion, but this time we want to go deeper into the subject and also learn about the results of this 9th FOCAC and any important developments or issues we should be aware of. To help with this, we thought to have our China expert with us too, Professor Warwick Powell. Together they should be able to get at all the details and principles as well as the issues. Let's bring him on. Hi, Warwick. Hi, Jana. Welcome.
Hi, Clive.
Excellent. Thanks for coming. All right. So how did the 9th FOCAC go this time around? Were you there, Jana?
No, unfortunately I wasn't, but I was keeping a close eye all the way from South Africa. I think it went very well. It was very much on trend with how we have seen the developments of China-Africa relationship since the last 2021 FOCAC, which, as you mentioned, was online. So I think it was just the solidifying once again, small and beautiful push through the Belt and Road, those types of developments, increasing role of the private sector, similar to what we have been seeing and expected also coming from the third plenum and some of the shifts that happened there. And then, of course, increasing prominence of the new global initiatives. This is Global Security Initiative, Global Development Initiative, Global Civilization Initiative. So, of course, a lot to unpack. But yeah, I would say it was a good Beijing action plan that also came from. It's very interesting and would be a good guiding mechanism for the coming 3 years.
Oh, great. Okay. Warwick, did you hear about it?
Well, who couldn't hear about it?
Yeah.
It was a very big event. It's the first time in 6 years, as you mentioned, when the delegates got together face to face and in person. 53 of the 54 nations of Africa were represented. In other words, all the countries of Africa that have formal diplomatic relationships with the People's Republic of China were there. And the overall delegations comprised obviously heads of state, government officials, representative of industry and community, as well as various media contingents. And judging by the images of the main plenary sessions, there would easily have been 3,000 to 4,000 participants from the Africa side and the China side, as well as media observers there. So I think in terms of creating a focal point with significant combined energy by having a lot of people together with a shared objective of finding common ground and finding pathways through which they could collaborate to mutual benefit, created a solid platform from which the next 3 years of Africa-China collaborations can develop. China, as you know, during the course of the event, announced 10 broad initiatives to take the relationship to the next level, or to progress it over the next 3 years. The headline, of course, is around $50 billion worth. It's in the order of 360 billion RMB, made up of a combination of credit lines as well as other forms of funding. Interestingly, too, China made commitments to assist African nations to issue so-called panda bonds in the China market, which is RMB-denominated bonds to enable Chinese institutions and citizens, where appropriate, to invest in bonds to support the financing of development initiatives in Africa. So I think that from a financing point of view, that was quite important. And the other highlight for mine, and we can go through some of the other details shortly, was the announcement of the lifting of tariffs for developing nations, in terms of exports into China, which will impact 33 African nations who will, by the end of this year, begin to benefit from zero-tariff access to the China market. And interestingly, the timing of that took place just as Donald Trump, for example, announced an intention to impose tariffs on countries that don't want to do business in the United States dollar. So,
yeah, 100%.
So the contrast and the optics was quite interesting, though I'm sure it was quite accidental.
I'm sure it was. Well, yeah, we wonder. So I'll put this question to you, Jana, and Warwick, jump into. How do African nations perceive China's increasing influence and investments, particularly in light of China's $50 billion pledge and military aid to the continent? Do you see this as a positive force for African development, or are there concerns about dependency?
I think central to all of it ultimately remains, okay, yes, we saw the 50.7 billion commitment, and it looks great. And I think something that was also very central in the current geopolitical environment is having those big lines, having those moments, ultimately showing that China is coming to the plate when it comes to some of its global South partners. So that just optics-wise, I think was also very central for FOCAC. Of course, the actual deal stemming from FOCAC, a lot of it happens in the months, if not the years preceding, that there's a build-up towards the different working groups to what ultimately we see in the headlines. So from that perspective, I definitely think it was central to get that. What this means for Africa, one of my personal issues with it is ultimately the lack of transparency. So not all debt is bad debt. A lot of African countries ultimately need that financing to develop their economies and move forward. There is no way of getting around that, and it's simply just the capital influx that's needed. However, the type of projects that it's being spent on and how it's being implemented by African partners as well is what will be central to whether or not this 50.7 billion increases debt dependency or debt distress, or ultimately is the capital influx needed to move these economies forward. So that level of understanding exactly what the implementation will look like is very essential. Now, we can gather from what we've seen in terms of the 30 new renewable energy and green investments that will also pledge alongside another 30 infrastructure investments that were all part of the pledges made. We can gather that from the Belt and Road since 2021, we saw this push for what is called small and beautiful. So more small, greener, for example, solar power plants, these types of investments that oftentimes assist in getting more of an immediate profitability from the African side, as well as the Chinese implementing partner, and doesn't have as bad of an impact on debt distress. So it can be good, it can be bad. It really just depends on what is ultimately done with this money. So that would be my 2 cents on that. But it is a very loaded topic, and it is quite difficult to unpack. But happy to get into it.
Yeah, that's the detail. I mean, this is, and you definitely, the last time we spoke, you really got into this, and it was quite a general discussion though, but you definitely talked about transparency being an issue. But that's a great example, and I think that's exactly the sort of thing the audience, we want to communicate to the audience, especially from an expert like yourself, is this is more complicated than the headlines. There's more to this, and that's why we have you guys on. And yeah, so Warwick, did you want to add something?
I think that there's a couple of interesting dynamics, and that is, firstly, I think that there is also a changing nature of funding in a couple of ways. Firstly, the New Development Bank, which is the BRICS Bank, has embarked on increasing its ability to provide finance to member countries and businesses in member countries in national currencies, and it has had a very successful bond raise in Rand last year. So I think that there is going to be a growing degree to which national currency-based finance plays a greater role. And that's quite important because when you look at economic development, the question is to what extent is foreign capital needed and why, as opposed to what extent can national resources be mobilized through the issuance of national currency denominated finance. So we're starting to get to a much better understanding, in effect, of the kinds of resources that are actually available in the countries that are seeking to develop, and how those resources can actually be mobilized with domestic currencies. So, for example, if you need to hire a bunch of people to undertake a particular activity in a particular country, there's actually no need for those people to be financed through foreign capital. Those people will be paid in domestic currencies, and therefore there is absolutely no reason why the mobilization of those resources can't or should not be done using credit denominated in national currencies. Foreign investment becomes necessary when it's needed to exchange for factors of production that can only come from outside of the country, and that could be machinery or know-how. So they're the sorts of things I think. So that's the first thing, is that I think that there is a bit of a shift now to national currency denominated financing and a clearer understanding of what it is that you need foreign capital for and what it is that you can mobilize with national currency denominated finance. The second thing is I get the sense that we're also going to see a growth in equity-based investments from Chinese enterprises rather than debt-financed development going forward. Yes, we can see in the announcement from FOCAC that there is a component of that $50 billion to be made available as a line of credit. Now, from memory, that's in the order of about 2/3 of those funds, so about 35 billion or thereabouts. 30 billion will take the form of a line of credits, but somewhere in the order of $10 billion will be direct equity investment, and about 12 billion or thereabouts will come from other forms of direct assistance as well, which I think is an interesting mix. And I think Jana's point about transparency and use of funds and effectiveness of the use of funds is always important in any development activity, to make sure that the results actually are lasting and have impact. The transition in small and is beautiful kind of rhetoric, I think, speaks to the fact that the heavy lifting has been done for a lot of the heavy infrastructure that's needed to actually enable people and communities and enterprises to reach markets. And now we've got to move to that next phase to build the kinds of things that can make use of that infrastructure. If you've got roads and rail and airports and ports, then you're going to need enhanced activities to make use of those, and that's where I think the effort's going to go.
Which sort of brings in security, because there's a lot of security issues currently. Like before the show started, you're talking about West Africa, North Africa. These are in the headlines, but I'll just leave that as a comment, because we are going to try and keep it under an hour. So, but I'll put this to you, Warwick. With the growing competition between China, the US, and Europe, that's the headlines for influence in Africa. What do you believe are the key factors that differentiate China's approach to development and diplomacy on the continent from that of Western nations?
Well, Western nations have been in Africa for a few hundred years now, and in the course of that few hundred years, they've left their mark. I'm sure that the countries and the people of Africa will have their own views about what that mark means and what the legacy has been. In terms of the current situation, I think what we're starting to see in parts of Africa, certainly, for example, in the Sahel in West Africa, is a reactivation or an intensification of efforts to push through a decolonialization effort. And there has been some success in relation to that, certainly in terms of the politics of moving the French and the Americans on. Whether or not that leads to long-term economic development and stabilization in the region, well, time will tell. But I think we are starting to see a greater activation around some of those long-standing legacies of colonialism that have remained unresolved. We're also, I think, likely to see, of course, intensified security competition, if you will, as the Americans and the Europeans, to certain extents, seek to establish a new footing in Africa. We notice, for example, that the Americans are mobilizing the rhetoric that China is the new colonial force, et cetera, et cetera. Now, again, the extent to which these things become meaningful and impactful will largely, I think, hinge on whether or not the relationships that are forged through forums such as FOCAC and the follow-up work that continues to take place actually delivers on the ground, whether it makes a genuine impact as far as economic development is concerned and enables African communities to begin their own paths of modernization and the improvement of their livelihoods. I should just mention two other things very, very briefly in terms of the security issues, and that is that part of the announcement packages of those 10 initiatives that were mentioned at FOCAC, two of them I think are quite explicitly security oriented. One of them is to implement a partnership to provide military assistance, where China will provide some 6,000 military personnel, police officers, and also invite African military officers to visit China for training, undertake joint military exercises, training and patrol, etc., etc. That's one of them. The second one is an initiative revolving around what has been called governance, which is to provide access for African, folk from government and political parties to engage with Chinese counterparts and I guess develop mutual learnings around questions of governance. And I think that there's going to be some interesting things unfold in that particular arena as well. The United States has for many, many decades run exchange programs to enable visitors to personally experience the institutions of American, the American political system at work, and to create links between the American political institutions and people from other parts of the world. And I think this relatively small initiative from China, coming out of FOCAC, in a sense, seeks to do those sorts of things as well.
Okay. Jana, if you want to add something, go ahead, please.
Yeah, okay. I think two very interesting things that was touched on is firstly the local community benefit. That's been some critique that Chinese investment in Africa has received for quite some time, be it because of the narrative that China imports their own labor. Of course, it's skilled labor is necessary for a lot of these projects. But the concern was that there's never a trickle-down effect to the actually community level, so everyday Africans. And what we saw in terms of outcomes from this FOCAC is, for example, I think it was in Kenya, significant investment in rural roads. There's still a gaping infrastructure deficit in Africa. So in order to have that, to facilitate intracontinental trade and all of this, it also just trickles down, what do people need to get from the one village to the other village? What is that space of need? And that's something we saw addressed in this. There was also the pledge to create 1 million jobs for Africans through a lot of these investments, which is, yes, in a significant context like Africa, it's a drop in the bucket. But I think what is more important is the symbolism behind it. It's this increasing cognizance coming from Beijing that this is what Africa is asking for. This is what is necessary. So that level of engagement, I think, is very positive, and is something that we can build on in the future. Of course, it has to be coupled with also human capacity development, which is something that I think a lot of these Chinese initiatives attempt to address. So that's a step in the right direction. But Xi Jinping has said this, and the consensus remains China is not going to provide a solution to all of Africa's problems. China can provide a tool that African countries can utilize in their own developmental context to move forward. But it's not going to be able to fix the infrastructure problems, the human capital development problems, all of these major concerns. And this is where I also think that a space for collaboration does come in, where in an increasingly divided geopolitical world, it mustn't be, are you pro-West, are you pro-China? It should be, you are pro-African, and trying to understand how these developments can all play together. Now, we can't have this conversation without addressing the elephant in the room, and that is there's big geopolitical competition and pressure coming from all sides to ultimately navigate this. Not to get into it in too much detail, but that's a space where a collective African position becomes really important in order to also have that bargaining power when engaging with all of these actors and the tension amongst them. And then on the topic of security cooperation, I think one of the big reasons it's so prominent is as Chinese business expands on the continent, there needs to be security for those investments. There needs to be security for Chinese civilians. And in order to also develop that capacity, China needs to, be it through local capacity development, be it through having feet on the ground, that type of investment is really important. And it also ultimately serves their own interest. And then there's the other side of it, where if China wants to project itself as the leader of the developing world, it wants to increasingly be seen as a great power, certain responsibilities are also imposed upon it. And that is playing a more active role in peace and security on the international stage. Now, yes, they have done a lot of it in terms of contributions to UN peacekeeping, using these multilateral bodies, but there's also increasing pressure for them to step up to the plate on that. And I think that's why we're seeing increasingly China trying to get involved in conflict mediation, trying to bring the Chinese brand of security cooperation, which is heavily grounded in the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, that is not interventionist, but ultimately does give that type of capacity, showing the Chinese model, not imposing the Chinese model. So I think that's also a big reason why we saw security on the forefront that much this year.
Yeah, and I'll just, for the audience too, there'll be links below of the official FOCAC website, and then there's also a rundown, some media, official media, of the event and what Xi Jinping spoke about. So as Warwick has referenced, so just so you can follow along, that will be there. So there's a particular term which sort of goes to this, and the term is strategic partnership. And I was hoping that maybe I'll put this to you guys. If you could describe, I mean, it's used to describe the base of the relationship between China and the African countries. Is this a loose term, or is it actually a legal term with an approved composition?
So from my understanding, it's more of a political and diplomatic term. So it's not like a legally binding agreement. However, it's similar to someone going from my friend to my best friend. Although that sounds quite small, I'm more likely to have lunch with my best friend more than my friend. So basically what this trickles down to is it just shows how central these relationships are in China's own development strategy and its own path moving forward. So, of course, it has a lot of implications as well, like increased economic connections, increased security connections. But I would say it's very much a diplomatic and a political term. I'm not sure, Prof. Maybe you have another view on that.
No, it only becomes legally binding through treaties and other agreements entered into by participating states. But as a broad description, it does aim exactly as you described it, which is to position the tone of the relationship to a certain level, which is well beyond merely being acquaintances, but to partners that are going to seek to align and coordinate their individual efforts in ways that buttress and amplify the capacity for each partner to achieve what they're seeking to achieve. So it does imply a deepening of the interrelationships and the intertwining of interests, so that the interests of the participants become less divisible, and in fact become over time far more integrated and indivisible.
Mm. Well, actually, I'll put this to you first, Warwick, at least. China has emphasized this, strategic partnership with Africa, particularly through initiatives like the Global Security Initiative. And again, the links you'll see, that's explained, like the Global Security Initiative and military cooperation. How does China envision the future of its security and military cooperation with African nations?
Look, I think China is actually still working out what it means for China to be a great power again, especially in the 21st century. And the three documents, or the documents that you've touched on, which is the Global Security Initiative, the Global Development Initiative, and the Global Civilization Initiative, seek to provide a framework for China to actually think about itself, how it wants to be, number one, and therefore also communicate that to others. Now, I think at a high level, at a macro strategic level, the objective is to bring a particular Chinese philosophical sensibility to the table, which actually views the world and the relationships between nations and civilizations in the world through a set of lenses that is distinctly Chinese and perhaps also draws broadly from an Asian philosophical tradition, and which therefore distinguishes it from the approaches that have dominated a Western approach to international relations. Now, the Chinese approach is intentionally and explicitly holistic. Rather than seeing nations as atoms that are floating around in an anarchic environment whose interests periodically bump into each other and interact, the Chinese philosophical view approaching the world is that all parts of the world are actually interconnected with each other. And with that as a starting point, trying to figure out how the interests of one are actually interwoven with the interests of others becomes the principal challenge. And if we can start to open up the kinds of dialogues that enable that to take place, for those kinds of explicit understandings of the intertwinings of interests to become well understood from all sides, then there is the potential then for decisions to be made that actually take into account the combined interests of all. Now, that's all great in theory and philosophy. The challenge is always going to come in converting that to practical actions. And that's where I think China continues to be a work in progress. And it will, in part, be driven by its own thinking on it. And sometimes it will also be pulled or called to action as a result of the circumstances of the world. Time will again tell how these balances and thought processes unfold in practical terms. But I think that those three initiatives aim to frame a distinctly Chinese attitude and posture towards how it thinks the world works and how it thinks it can play a role together with others in the shaping of the world into the future.
I very much agree with that, Prof. And I think you touched on a very, very important topic in the sense that I think a lot of the confusion and the narrative going on framing as China, for example, as a new colonial power or debt trap diplomacy. We've all heard these stories. I think, especially with the security expansion as well, coming from a Western school of thought and more of a Hobbesian view of the world, a realist view, it's very difficult, I think, to conceptualize this rise of China when there's just a completely different philosophical underpinning to how that is taking place. And the issue in a space that I oftentimes come across working with policymakers is camps not really understanding what one another is saying. And I think it's very novel, not to China necessarily, but to the rest of the world, to ultimately understand what these engagements mean. It's not necessarily to assert authority, but it is ultimately because it is a shared community, the way in which Chinese ultimately view it.
Yeah. Look, Jana, I'll give you an example. You know, Asia, where of course China is located, has had millennia of experience in its relationships with this big, civilization called China, and this goes back thousands of years. And those relationships have been conceptualized and operationalized in very different ways than the Hobbesian view of the world. And I think that there is a lot to be drawn from the experiences of Asia before the Europeans that will actually help others understand how China is seeking to re-articulate a vision for how it thinks of the world and how it thinks it fits into the world. So, so there is actually historical ground to draw upon, but of course, much of the history that many know today has been a history written by the West, from the West, and the experiences of Asia before the Europeans has largely been shoved aside in favor of a history of Western civilizations. But when we begin to explore, for example, the interactions between the Chinese civilizations of the Tang and the Sung dynasties and their interactions with Persia, the various civilizations of India, the entrepot ports and city-states that dotted through Southeast Asia, then we begin to see a very different way of cross-civilizational, cross-community interactions. And I'll leave this thought with, or this train of thought with, one little observation, and that is that in all of these thousands of years of interactions, China has been the biggest player on the block, civilizationally, population-wise, economic-wise, and yet right across Southeast Asia, there is not one language group that's been eviscerated and replaced by Chinese, and the cultural strengths and unique identities of the communities of, modern Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei, New Guinea, right through what we call Indochina today, and of course around into Bangladesh, and then of course into India and Pakistan onwards. None of those have actually been transformed into mini Chinas. They're all unique. They all have their own roots in their own history, even though they've had thousands of years of deep interactions with the Chinese. And I think that there's something in that for us to be reflecting upon today.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually watched a particular, I think it was the Schiller Institute or LaRouche Pack, as it was known back then. Beautiful documentary that showed the civilization of China over a very long period, but it was very specifically showing the actual history where China was a massive trading partner, and they sort of espouse today what we hear on the news, that they traded with everyone and they had a very different attitude to everyone, which sort of you're sort of touching on their work without going into detail. But I would encourage your audience to look for that. We're not going to provide the link, but it was actually very interesting, and it actually changed my view of China to actually know the true history of its attitude, of how it actually viewed the world and this. Because usually when the historians, how the West has portrayed China, is that there's been internal struggles in China, and it's only been about that, not really an interaction with the rest of the world. And what's that been like? What has been their attitude? So anyway, I'm carrying on here. Sorry. But yeah, it was very interesting, and then you actually get a good idea, right? But one of the things I'm trying to do here too, Warwick and Jana, with the FOCAC is there's certain terms like strategic partnership, which I'm trying to define a little bit more with you guys, and because I want our audience to understand really what's actually happening. What are they actually talking about? When you're diplomats and you're experts, when you're professors, doctors, right? You guys know what this stuff means, but the everyday person doesn't necessarily. So there is a reference to a 6-point proposition of modernization. What is this? Maybe Jana, if you want to take that up, or
so in terms of the 6-point plan for modernization, it's in a lot of ways drawn from China's own experience in its own developmental path, and ultimately creating areas in which there can be collaboration and capacity sharing in these different areas. So one thing that's very prominent in the manner in which China engages in Africa that I think is very intentional, because something that a lot of African countries have struggled with is oftentimes the imposition of certain government structures by external parties, be it through aid, having that conditionality. So that is something that is very strong in the African context, being able to assert its own future. So within this space, it creates a blueprint that can be used where it is suitable within an African context without ultimately imposing it. So that, in terms of these plans and sets of actions put forth, ultimately work towards that goal. I hope that's the answer you were looking for.
No, that's good. Go ahead, Warwick, if you're going to say something. Go ahead.
Look, frankly, I don't think I can add to Jana's excellent summary and positioning of any of this. What I would probably just say again is that those three key documents, the Civilization Initiative, Development Initiative, and the Security Initiative, are actually foundational descriptions, if you will, of how it is that China thinks about these sorts of issues. And from that comes things like the 6-point initiatives and other more concrete programs and partnerships and funding programs. But underpinning all of this is the idea that the partner nations will have their own ways of doing things. They will have their own institutions that have evolved through time, that have legitimacy in their own communities, and that is the starting point. They are the building blocks. How existing communities and political institutions and other institutions exist and operate, because those institutions is actually what comes out of the history of places. It's not like you can have this catalogue of models that you just pluck and push onto a bunch of people, as if a group of human beings in a place is a blank sheet of paper, right? So the starting point of this idea of civilizations and development and security is that every place has its own history. And that history brings with it certain experiences, certain attitudes, approaches to framing problems, approaches of prioritizing things that matter and things that don't. That's what we loosely call culture. And the institutions by which groups of people arrive at decisions concerning things that matter commonly to them. Now, how those groups of people do that is a matter for those groups of people. It's not a matter for someone with an external model to say, well, you know, if you're going to get the benefit of our information technology infrastructure, then you're going to need to do things this way. Well, actually, we're going to roll out telecommunications infrastructure into your community so that you can continue exploring your own development path through the institutions that have been handed to you through your own history. And that's it.
That's interesting perspective on modernization.
No, definitely. I think it's very different from what we have been used to, I think, in Africa, some of our external partners over these past few years. So then it becomes very difficult when you have some points such as the way in which the Chinese conceptualization of human rights, for example, and this is something I don't have the answer to, that I'm looking at in my own research, where you need to understand which structures do we have in place at the moment in terms of, for example, the AU's human rights architecture. Furthermore, like the Africa Peace and Security architecture. So trying to understand how Africa, for the time being at least, has defined how it wants these spaces to look like, and then trying to contrast how does for example, the GSI expansion, how would that be contributing towards the African conceptualization of a lot of things? And where in some places might it potentially erode the way in which Africa has conceptualized these frameworks? Now, the big issue of that comes in from an African side, I would argue, in China has been very clear in what they want from the Africa relationship. They have been very clear in the China-Africa 2035 plan. And as Prof mentioned, a lot of these engagements stretches back centuries. So this framework is in place, but the same can't be said for the African side. So then you risk ultimately the Chinese voice becoming stronger than the African voice. And you can't point a finger at Beijing in that regard, because I mean, there has been consultation with African stakeholders that has been in place. This is something that has to organically come from the African side in terms of its engagement with all of these external powers. So that would just be, I think, a note in terms of a nuance in that engagement to keep in mind.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think that's actually a really important point. Africa is a very, very large continent, which is actually bigger in real life proportionately than most of your typical maps would show. Is a place that was carved up really by a bunch of colonial powers, often in ways that drew lines on maps to create administrative sovereignties that have no bearing to the historical relationships between essentially cultural civilizations, which of course creates focal points of conflict, right? So, and consequently, it enabled Africa to be carved up in ways that suited the interests of colonial powers historically. And we've seen that in all sorts of places where the zones of conflict really arise around lines on maps that are artificially imposed by colonial powers. Now, until those sorts of issues are resolved, and until there is a cohesive view from the continent around the things that the continent considers to be of common and shared interest, it's always going to be very difficult for nations to optimize, the relationships that they each have with each other, of course, but also with external parties. And, for what it's worth, I would love to see enhanced cohesion from Africa and the countries in Africa around the strategic issues that will enable the continent to become stronger as a sovereign continent and to benefit the populations locally by harnessing the tremendous resources that exist on the continent. And I don't just mean the resources in the ground. I mean the tremendous demographic resources of a young, energetic and large population. I mean, this is a tremendous opportunity for a lot of people, a couple of billion people, but for humanity really to grasp the possibilities of a very different future by working closely with the young people, the relatively young demographics of the African continent. And a cohesive Africa will help Africa do that. And also, I think a cohesive Africa, particularly around things that it is rich and abundant in, such as natural resources, will enhance the ability of African nations and people to actually maximize the benefit of being resource owners, as opposed to the experiences of the past 200 plus years of being the victims of resource expropriation.
Yeah, actually on that, oh, sorry, go ahead, Jana.
No, if I can just add in terms of that, with the FOCAC outcome, something I really liked is, so the REX played not a significant role, but they did play a role at this year's FOCAC, as they've been present before as well. We saw like the Tazara Railway, we saw some of these regional infrastructure projects. Of course, we have the AU present in the room as well, I believe, between the African Continental Free Trade Agreement and FOCAC, or China specific, the Secretariat, there is communication, there is MOUs, there is these pathways for collaboration. And I think it was also very clear in some of the outcomes documents that Agenda 2063, essentially for the audience, that is the AU's blueprint of Africa we want in the long term. So that was very much respected, I think, in terms of a lot of the outcomes we saw from FOCAC. So just a plus point. I know a lot of times it's easy to criticize some of these engagements, but that was definitely a step in the right direction coming from this year's FOCAC.
Yeah, good. That's good to hear. Some positive on that side. Well, mentioning minerals, and I'll put this to you, Jana. Given China's focus on Africa's critical minerals and the push for more processed goods, how do you think African countries can best balance the economic benefits with the risks of over-reliance on China for exports and infrastructure development?
I would say that the first step to China to reduce over-reliance on any external partner is moving up the value chain, be it as simple as the first level of manufacturing post-extraction is one of the first steps that we need. So moving up a value chain, firstly. Secondly, making investments that benefit intra-regional trade, intra-African trade is very essential priority. And these are two things that we saw coming from a lot of African president statements as well. Wanting to move up the value chain, wanting to increase intracontinental trade. So all different aspects moving towards Agenda 2063, essentially, moving towards that roadmap. So that first is one of the best ways to safeguard against these external powers. And I believe we are heading into a more geopolitically turbulent space in the coming decades. So it's important to have that safeguard. So in terms of the Chinese investment specifically we saw from FOCAC and that type of engagement, I think it provides a lot of opportunity to move forward. But it's also important to remember that China isn't this altruistic actor. And a lot of the mobilization of the private sector as well, this is win-win cooperation. So it's a business deal. And that's, once again, it remains important for African countries to conceptualize how it needs this engagement to look like to ultimately be economically beneficial to local communities. And that needs to come from the African side and the African governments in terms of what the structure of these deals are and what the trickle-down effect is. So I would say that's one of the best ways to safeguard against this these engagements of not reinforcing a lot of the value chains that is still in place from colonial days. So trying to move away from that. Chinese investment, Belt and Road Initiative, a lot of these things provide opportunities to move past it. It's not going to provide the solution. That can only come from Africa's side.
Yeah, we had that issue, and Warwick's in Queensland of Australia, but we had the same issue in Australia. There's no value add. Don't get me wrong. When we say that there's very little and they're not value adding, recently there's been a proposal, which Warwick, you've probably heard about, the Iron Boomerang, which is in the northern of Australia on the east and west coasts, up making a railway and then making steel from the iron ore and the coal, and actually engaging in that, and instead of just shipping out raw materials, which is what we do, and we do it really well here. So it's not just developing countries that have that issue too, I would just say. But I actually had the next sort of question I'll put into you, I think we're probably not going to have enough time, but what I would say to the audience is, again, I put links below, and I would encourage your audience to look at that, because basically what I was going to ask the guys was there's the 10 partnership actions, and they're actually in the document. So you will see that and you can have a look at them. And because Warwick has sort of mentioned this a few times already, the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, and the Global Civilization Initiative, which are these plans for foundational plans for this strategic partnership. So, but because I'm sort of going a little bit ahead here, guys, because I want to give you at the end here an opportunity if you want to say something. So, but before you do that, the last thing I want to just ask you is a blueprint was drawn up for China-Africa cooperation going forward. The two sides adopted a Beijing Declaration and an action plan for strengthening China-Africa cooperation in the next 3 years. What are these?
So the Beijing Action Plan. So just quick recap of, it's not legally binding. It's basically, it traces a few different commitments, and I think it's quite self-explanatory when you read through it. And we've touched on almost all of the themes ultimately included in the action plan. So it's just a guiding document for how China-Africa relations is going to develop in the next 3 years. In terms of, we see the small is beautiful, we see increased security development initiatives, people-to-people exchanges through GCI. So a lot of these themes we've discussed is just cemented in this action plan to ultimately give an outline to what the relationship will look like heading into the next FOCAC.
Oh, okay, gotcha. Okay, well, look, as again, I've put links below that give excellent details on the FOCAC, and you should do your research yourself as well. They are good references. They are officially from the official website and also the media publications of the event. The development in Africa is a very significant matter. I think here, hopefully the audience has got how significant it is. There have been centuries of war, subversion, and suppression, and internally, Africa has its own issues, which Jana, in our previous interview, outlined sensitively. African countries are highly enthusiastic, and we are seeing and participating in it right now. So, Warwick, Jana, I want to give this opportunity for you to give your thoughts on anything further, as experts, developing in your careers and the education that you would like to present to the public. Please be clear and take this opportunity to address the public.
Professor, you can go ahead if you want to go.
All right. Okay. Look, I just really wanted to pull some threads together more than anything else about the challenges and opportunities for African nations emerging out of not only this current FOCAC, but with the foundations that have been laid to date. Economic development and modernization is a complex activity that ultimately involves creating ecosystems that enable human beings to have high levels of appropriate skills and knowledges, together with access to a broad range of resources and materials. But underpinning all of that is energy. And I'm talking about energy for people, food for people, and energy for machines, because the capacity of economic development to take place ultimately hinges on the ability for the humans and the machines to have access to sufficient energy of the right kinds to be able to do the things that they need to do. And this idea of energy really goes to the heart of the economic development pathway. There is no economic development without the development of energy ecosystems. There isn't a well-developed country that is energy poor, right? And I think one of the challenges and opportunities over the next 10, 20, and 30 years is for African nations to develop a higher degree of energy sovereignty that will enable the countries to pursue economic development with an energy infrastructure to harness, to generate, to store, and make available for use energy that is low cost and low carbon impact. Now, those opportunities exist today, and that is the first order challenge, is to make sure that that happens. From that comes the need to continually enhance infrastructure that facilitates connectivity, because economic development also requires the ability for people and materials and finished products to move from one place to another, so that the development opportunities across a continent can be met and that the needs of communities of people can be served in the most effective way. So transport connectivity on the back of energy connectivity and energy infrastructure are two. The third piece of the equation, which goes to ultimately the question of know-how, is to build human capital together with information technology infrastructure that is also capable of empowering nations to have data sovereignty. So we have energy sovereignty, we have data sovereignty, because without data sovereignty, countries will always be exposed to the weaponization of their information infrastructure, either for propaganda reasons or for sanctioning reasons to prohibit them from participating in cross-border exchanges. So my message, in a sense, is look at economic infrastructure development as part and parcel of the development of sovereign capabilities, because with sovereign capabilities ultimately comes the ability to address one's own security requirements.
Awesome. Go ahead, Jana.
Awesome. I think it was a strategic move to have Prof go first and give such an amazing breakdown of tying all the threads together. So I get to do the easier part because all of the important stuff has been said. But in terms of what I would take away from this, and just firstly a side note on this GCI, GDI, GSI, it sounds very confusing, but these are in fact not new. It's putting a brand on something China has been doing for years. And yes, this name will mean that there's more concerted effort to promote it, but it's not this intangible, far-off concept. And it's also something that, as it rolls out across the world, it's important for the citizens of the spaces where this will roll out to be familiar with it, trying to understand it, and also having in civil society spaces, having those tough conversations to understand what will this mean for my region in the micro sense. Then I think that would go into my last point of this as well. I think a lot of these conversations oftentimes feel very far off in terms of its practical manifestation, and that leads to the public being desensitized to ultimately engage in it and look into it. And I think that's why platforms such as BRICS Briefs is so important to ultimately have those tough decisions. And as this conversations and as this increasing global South cooperation goes forward, and increasingly a new mold for a more sustainable type of partnership and relationship has to be developed, it's increasingly important to have these conversations and understand what the implications of it would be. So that would be my tie together in terms of all of these themes moving forward, and just absolutely highlighting this need for not only between policymakers, but between citizens, having these conversations and trying to understand it. Not just specifically the Chinese initiatives, but of course what these American engagements are looking like. There were recent announcements or speculations of the US also ramping up its military assistance to Africa, coinciding after these announcements from FOCAC. So trying to understand what, as these great or increasing powers try to establish what they want from their development partners, it's important for the partners to also understand what do we want from these actors, and safeguarding against not just being pawns on this great geopolitical chessboard, but being active players and promoting our own interests, be it in Australia, be it in African countries, which sometimes might be a bit more challenging. But yeah, that would be my key takeaway.
Yeah, I totally agree. As an advocate myself here in Australia, and Warwick's in Australia too, lucky for him, we are definitely trying to get citizens active to participate in the political process, which is not easy because that has been subverted. So yeah, no, that's really important too, Jana. Well, look, we're almost under an hour, so I'm going to end it off. Thank you very much, Warwick. Thank you very much, Jana. We'll have you on again, and there'll be something happening, or if you would like to propose anything, please do. All right. All right. So if you've enjoyed this episode and wish to join the conversation, you can comment below. Please like and share this episode and spread it as far as possible. We're putting together a plan to bring you right into the middle of the Kazan Summit. We want you to be more than just spectators. We want you to be part of the action. We're funding this ourselves, so if you want to support our efforts, you can do so with a super thanks, through donations on our Buy Me a Coffee page, or just by spreading this video around to your network. Any contributions you can make is appreciated. Thanks for tuning in to BRICS Briefs. Don't forget you can follow us on our Substack and other social media platforms, especially our Telegram channel, for daily news on BRICS, all linked below. Stay curious, stay connected, stay optimistic, and let's keep exploring together. Tot Sens, Zaijian.